Now it has finally become clear why the director of the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States visited Moscow the other day and what secret decrees the Russian dictator signed after this visit. Vladimir Putin believes that peace negotiations on Ukraine have reached a complete deadlock and preparations are underway for an escalation of hostilities and increased missile strikes on Ukraine. At the same time, those in the Russian president's inner circle are increasingly afraid that he will ultimately resort to using tactical nuclear weapons, since he admits that he simply cannot achieve victory by any other means. Bloomberg reported this today, citing sources close to the Kremlin, and in fact, this is not the first such signal. Exactly the same alarming conversation about nuclear weapons already took place in 2000. When the CIA director, at that time William Burns, personally met with the head of Russian intelligence, Naryshkin, specifically about this issue. So let's go through the latest Bloomberg article in full in this episode and discuss what it says and what insider information Bloomberg is revealing today about Putin's plans to escalate this war. My name is Alexei Pichi, let's discuss this topic, but before we start, I'd like to ask you to subscribe. Subscribe to the channel, like the episode and don't forget to leave your comment. So let's start with the most important thing. According to Bloomberg sources, Russia plans to intensify ballistic missile strikes on Kyiv in the near future, including strikes on the city center, where government buildings are concentrated, as well as on infrastructure facilities in other Ukrainian cities. The negotiations, which had been going on for about a year and a half with the mediation of Donald Trump's administration, have in fact ended in failure. This is according to Bloomberg sources. Both sides are in the same position as they were at the start of these negotiations. Ukrainian strikes on Russian territory have affected dozens of oil refineries, ports and e-commerce warehouses. In Moscow, they consider it an attack not from Ukraine, but from the North Atlantic Alliance, since the alliance provides Kiev with weapons and intelligence. And that is why Vladimir Putin is trying to inflate this issue for a hybrid or small-scale war against Europe. And Bloomberg sources assure that despite economic pressure, the fuel crisis and strikes on logistics hubs, Vladimir Putin does not plan to end the war. This maniac has decided to drown all ordinary Russians in blood because he cannot back down from his maximalist goals. According to sources, the current phase of mutual strikes is still far from the peak of military escalation, and Putin is preparing to intensify them. Interestingly, sources from the publication claim that the current ballistic missile attacks on Ukraine in Vladimir Putin's plan were supposed to have already forced Kiev to make concessions. But here is the most alarming thing. More and more Russian officials are coming to the conclusion that Vladimir Putin may use tactical nuclear weapons against Ukraine as a last resort. Calls from pro-war hardliners in the Kremlin advocating for such a nuclear move have been growing louder lately. And since losing the war seems like a completely unacceptable scenario, personally, for bold dwarf Putin, since diplomacy over Ukraine has come to a halt, Moscow sees few alternatives to escalation. 4 sources close to the Kremlin told Bloomberg about this. The Kremlin still hopes that Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, special envoys of Donald Trump, will still bring some new proposals to Moscow, although expectations for a breakthrough are very low. And Putin hopes that if they do bring something, it will definitely be Ukraine's capitulation. At the same time, Bloomberg immediately adds an important caveat. There are currently no signs that Vladimir Putin is preparing to use nuclear weapons right now. Russia's partners, including China and India, are strongly opposed and have sent a strict warning to the Kremlin against taking such a step. But, as they say, we've already been through this story back in 2022. But what's important is that now, in the West, this scenario is being seen as the truly last resort of a desperate Vladimir Putin. But let me remind you, this isn't the first time the United States of America has warned Moscow specifically about the nuclear issue. The administration of Joe Biden had already warned about the consequences of a nuclear strike by Putin. Under Biden, the US told Vladimir Putin that the response would be a conventional strike by American air forces against Russia. They said it would be a direct air bombardment of Russia by the forces of the United States of America. No one is going to hide this. Vladimir Putin is testing right now how far he can go before the West gives in to him. And he's trying to figure out after which step the West will definitely sock him in his bald mug. Well, and here it's important to recall a specific episode. It was CIA Director William Burns, the predecessor of the current head of the agency, John Ratcliffe, who, as we already discussed in previous episodes, recently flew to Moscow, met with the head of Russian foreign intelligence Sergei Naryshkin in Turkey at the end of 2022. Specifically to convey to the Kremlin that using tactical nuclear weapons was unacceptable. At that time, let me remind you, the Russians were fleeing from the Kherson and Kharkiv regions, and Vladimir Putin, in fear, was desperately trying to save the situation. So, the scheme, in which a high-ranking American intelligence officer personally goes to war on Moscow about the nuclear issue, this is already a proven, recurring tool of American diplomacy, and not some new development today. But still, more experts are now convinced that the risk of Vladimir Putin using tactical nuclear weapons is extremely low. On the modern battlefield, the effectiveness of such a strike would be very limited, while the political costs of breaking the nuclear taboo would be very high. Therefore, as long as Moscow has room for escalation with conventional weapons, including increasing missile strikes, it has little reason to cross the nuclear threshold. Therefore, an increase in ballistic missile strikes is more likely, and as for nuclear weapons, Putin will once again use them as a tool for bluffing and bargaining. It's interesting that against this backdrop, an important detail was mentioned that directly relates to the negotiation deadlock Bloomberg is writing about today. The United States of America did not force Volodymyr Zelensky to make a deal with the Kremlin over Donbass, former special representatives.
Кит Келлог заявил сегодня,
Putin miscalculated by trying to trick his way into occupying the entire Donetsk region, vainly hoping that Donald Trump would force Zelensky to make concessions. Next is a quote from Kit Kellogg. Donald Trump personally did not pressure President Zelensky to voluntarily give up Donbass or the Donetsk region. It seems this became clear during the summit in Alaska. Trump told Putin directly, a straightforward message: if you want this land, fight for it. Kit Kellogg also stated that Trump and Putin have a long-standing personal relationship, and the US president has already used all possible diplomatic tools to end Russia's war against Ukraine. And this once again indicates that the negotiations are truly at a dead end. And finally, about how Ukraine is responding to all this alarming uncertainty. The president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, together with the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine, Mikhailo Dropati, was working in the Alexandrovsk sector, where they met with the servicemen of the 80th Separate Air Assault Halitska Brigade. The president thanked the Ukrainian soldiers for their service and honored the fighters with state awards. At the meeting with the commanders, they discussed the needs of the unit and the possibilities for strengthening their defense. Among the specific military requests were the provision of drones, long-range artillery, and small radar stations. The point is that it is precisely in the Alexandrivka direction that the armed forces of Ukraine have continued offensive actions since the beginning of this year. And during this time, Ukrainian forces have liberated 26 settlements in the Dnipropetrovsk, Donetsk, and Zaporizhia regions. In total, the armed forces of Ukraine have returned about 750 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory under Ukraine's control. On the same day, Zelensky, together with Dropati, the General Staff, and Defense Minister Yevhen Khmara, determined the order of further steps. Here is his quote. Our positions in Donetsk region will be strengthened thanks to two updated groupings. The commanders will be Hero of Ukraine Denis Prokopenko and Hero of Ukraine Andriy Bilecki. In summary, Bloomberg describes Putin as a person who considers negotiations dead and is preparing for a new wave of escalation. At the same time, the entourage of the bold dictator is increasingly discussing the nuclear option as a last resort, even though analysts assess the real likelihood of such a step as extremely low, and the precedent of the warning delivered through Burns and Narishke in 2017 shows that such conversations between intelligence agencies have already happened before, and at that time did not lead to the use of nuclear weapons. And at the same time, it turns out that Trump himself never forced Zelensky to give up Donbass, contrary to the hopes of the bold Putin. And Ukraine, in response to this entire deadlock, is not sitting idly by, but together with the president on the front line is strengthening specific areas of the front with new formations under the command of distinguished combat commanders. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode, subscribe to the channel, like this video and hit the bell icon. That's all for now, take care of yourselves, goodbye everyone.